Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 221. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Evette Davis about her new novel, The Others. It is the first installment in her urban paranormal fantasy series, The Council Trilogy. The main character, Olivia Shepherd, is a political consultant in San Francisco who stumbles upon a secret society of witches and vampires and discovers it is actively meddling in elections around the world. While uncovering this supernatural cabal, Olivia also learns some secrets about her own heritage. Evette Davis describes The Others as a metaphor for the ways in which women make peace with their own power in light of all the expectations placed upon them. The series is inspired by Evette's own experiences working for years in journalism and politics, and her stories are her imagination's way of fixing the world's thorny problems. In this episode, I'll chat with Evette about her writing journey, the skill of applying checks and balances that she uses when writing her stories, and why The Others owes its creation to her discovering that she's not a very good playwright, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Evette Davis, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your brand new book, The Others. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Well, The Others is about a secret society of witches and vampires who meddle in elections in the US and around the world to sort of keep fascism and nationalism at a tolerable level, I guess I'll say. And the heroine is a San Francisco political consultant who finds herself thrown into the middle of this shadowy organization. And when she's asked to run a congressional campaign, and then also learns a series of other sort of shocking secrets about her heritage. And, you know, it's at its core supposed to be a very thrilling, sexy paranormal romance thriller, but I think at its 30,000 foot view, it's a meditation. The whole trilogy is a meditation about women and how they find their power and how they manage it and come to peace with it, frankly, since it's difficult even now to be a woman leader in the world we live in.
What was the spark for this book? What was that thing that hooked you and you thought, okay, there's something here?
Right. Well, so this whole this whole trilogy owes its gratitude to the fact that I'm a terrible playwright, because what I started out thinking about was writing a play about a frustrated female political consultant who just sort of constantly is running up against sexism and just workplace issues, and out of the corner of her eye one day sees a woman warrior, a female warrior from like an ancient, civilization who's sort of trying to coach her off stage. Like, what are you doing? Just take this guy's head off with a sword, like be done with it, stand up for yourself. And so I embarked on trying to write a play to kind of tell this story and to give this, modern current day woman a foil to kind of run up against. And it just turns out I'm a terrible playwright. And so the kind of the foundation of Olivia and this story was born. And then what happened as I started getting into it is I realized it wasn't going to be a standalone novel. It was going to have legs and need to be a trilogy. So this, I think, was a kind of my internal way of solving the problems of being a political consultant, which is not very much anymore. But at the time when I first started my career, it was very much a more of a male dominated industry. And there were just a lot of moments where my idea sounded better when it came out of a man's mouth, So it's just, how do you contend with all that, right? So I let my character sometimes work out my therapy, I guess.
Very nice. I do think that that is probably the first time I've heard the inspiration for a book described that way, as it came about because it was a terrible playwright. I think that might be one of the more original stories for a book's inspiration, to be honest with you. So, well, let's talk about this main character, Olivia, because I'm curious now how she came about. It sounds like you poured a lot of personal ideas and issues and situations into not just her as a character, but into the story. So let's talk about how Olivia came into being.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't think Olivia is me. But I think that she's an amalgamation of a lot of frustrations I've seen and I've seen for other women. And I also think that, I don't know, somehow she just grew to be who she is. She's impatient. She has trust issues. I mean, not all of those things represent me, but I think what she is a metaphor for a sensation that all of us as women have about how do we make peace with our authority and our power in conjunction with the other expectations that we have. I mean, I think, obviously, I think women are incredible creatures. We are constantly metamorphosizing. We go from a daughter to a wife or a partner to a mother. We're leaders. We evolve over time, either by necessity or by choice, in ways that I don't think men do. Sorry, I love men, but they're just not, I think, as evolutionary as we are. But at our core, we still have all these expectations about ourselves. If you look at Hillary Clinton versus Kamala Harris, for example, Hillary, needed to be smart and in control, but too much. And she was bossy. She was like Hermione Granger or something. So Olivia she's just struggling to figure out how do I get knocked down? How do I get back up? Now I'm in power. What does that mean? And so I guess I did put a lot of thought into her that way, but how she came to have some of her imperfections, I read the reviews and it's like, she's frustrating. Yeah, she is. She's supposed to be. She's on a journey. She's having a moment where she's going to come to learn things about herself. And sometimes she's not going to take the lesson on the first go. And so you have to be willing to sit with her through the whole trilogy to figure out who she's going to really be as a human being. And I find that exciting as a writer.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you find when you read characters and you find them frustrating, do you find that it's because they're making decisions that either you see clearly very easily, or is it sort of a reflection, do you think, of ourselves? Like they make these decisions and we get frustrated because there's a possibility we may have made the same bad choices in life, or we may have been tempted to make those same bad choices.
I think it's the latter.
Yeah.
And I find those characters more interesting. And I think readers do too, when you're more like a human being.
Mm-hmm.
We do things that we regret, we miss opportunities, we say things to our loved ones that we, wish we hadn't. Like that's what being human is. And there's a difference. I mean, and we'll talk about 48 States. The villain in that book is such a villain. And I had people say like he's unbelievable. And yet he wasn't, but he's a really mean person. So, sometimes you write people who are uncomfortable because they do things that are just abhorrent. But sometimes you're writing about people who are flawed. And that to me is interesting if they can come out the other side, better for it. But I think, you have to be careful with readers because too much of something, I think, is too much of something, so somebody can be flawed, but if they spend the entire time trying your patience, I'm not sure you can, go with them for their whole journey. So that's a challenge as a writer, I think.
And a challenge, particularly, I guess, when you're writing a trilogy, you can't have them evolve so much in the first book that there's no room to grow in the latter books, but they have to change enough that
Right.
people want to continue to see what happens, continue to like them enough to carry on with their story.
Yes, exactly. You're exactly right.
I want to talk about a couple of things with respect to Olivia and the situations she finds herself in. So, first up, I'd like to talk about the council. I'd like to know your inspiration for this group. And then, how did you go about defining them, creating them, setting rules and boundaries? Like, what was your process for constructing the council?
I think that the council is a result of my years working in politics and journalism. So I started my career as a newspaper journalist. Then I went to Washington D.C., where I worked as an intern and then as a deputy press secretary for a member of Congress at a pivotal moment in the United States history when the Democrats lost the majority in both the House, the Senate, and during Clinton's midterm. And it was the age of cable television. The internet, believe it or not, hadn't been invented yet. But you were starting to see these just very sharp shifts in discourse, public discourse. And obviously it's accelerated over time. And I think that the council was my imagination's way of fixing a very thorny problem, which is that we have a very unstable political process where people are not able to communicate peacefully with each other. And, I remember talking to somebody in my family before, when Biden was running, and she said, I just don't know if I can trust him. He's so bipartisan. And that is a real warning sign for me, because to me, bipartisanship, moderation, the ability to communicate with people, to be empathetic, to understand somebody else's point of view, even when you don't necessarily agree to it, that is like a fundamental need that we have as a society. Take out political parties and just think about what we need as a society to be able to live together. We need to be able to understand one another, even when we're angry or don't agree. And so for me, the council is like, this is my way of fixing it. We could really use it right now. I'm sorry that it's magic. Maybe it will rub off. But so that was the reason for it. And then in terms of constructing it, I mean, I am at my core a terrible policy wonk, and I am a voracious reader and a student of history. And I looked at the UN and other kinds of NGOs, and I just made up a structure for an organization that kind of operated like the UN, but it happens to be full of supernatural creatures. And I loved the juxtaposition of these magical people having their own bureaucracy. And, one of the things I like to say about the others and the Council Trilogy is that I don't really think you've met these characters before. I don't think you've met a vampire who's was a member of the resistance in World War II and who's Jewish. I don't think you've met a shapeshifter who runs security for, a political organization. And I wanted to create a contemporary setting for these characters in which we could talk about real life problems, but use the magic of fantasy and paranormal to bend rules and push boundaries to have an important discussion.
Yeah. Now, have you always been a fan of paranormal and fantasy? Is this a genre or mixing of genres that you have naturally gravitated towards,
Yes.
or is this something new?
No, I mean, you can imagine me as a small child in my living room watching Star Trek with my dad and my sister. I've always, in fact, there was a joke in our family that, our husbands had to be able to see Star Trek movies in order to marry my sister. And I sort of barely passed that test. But yeah, I've always been a huge fan. I tell a story often if you look at any of the interviews I've done that I used to go to the public library in Los Angeles where I grew up, and I would go and sit on the floor and pull Stephen King books off the shelf. I think I've read Dracula probably, a half a dozen or more times. So I'm a voracious reader and I read all manner of things, but I in particular like science fiction and fantasy. And I like it, both for its entertainment value, and I like it because of the way it predicts and imagines things that are, have come true in society. Think about Fahrenheit 451 and, book banning and the emergence of screens, and George Orwell in 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale. God bless her for, people thought, oh my God, that's ridiculous. Oops. So I think that science fiction is a wonderful way to imagine things that maybe are a little too far out to talk about in a traditional novel, but through science fiction, you're given the auspices to imagine this very different, set of circumstances.
Right. Yeah. It's a way of recreating or reimagining how things could be better, right? Talk about
Yes.
the ways to make things better without having to shine a bright spotlight on all the things that are currently wrong with us. We see it, we feel it when we read science fiction and fantasy without having somebody kind of shouting in our face
That's
of
right.
all these things are wrong.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, because you had a unique challenge here. The book is set in San Francisco. So let's talk about the world building you had to do for real world settings, right? Because you're dealing with fantasy and paranormal elements. You can't just talk about life as we know it. There's a lot of things that you had to make up. And yet you're a bit hamstrung by the fact that you are talking about San Francisco. So I imagine it has to feel real enough for the people who know San Francisco to go, yeah, okay, I can see it. I feel it. I get it.
Right.
So where do you find that balance?
Well, I live in San Francisco. I've been here for 30 years, and I can tell you that it wasn't that hard. I think of the city as being tremendously magical. I mean, its light, its architecture, the way the fog rolls in, the certain narrowness of streets, the jewel box quality. I mean, I think for anybody who appreciates architecture or is creative or who has an imagination, I think the city is a, I don't want to say easy, but it's an inspirational place to be. And so for me, I live not very far. So I will say two things that are true. Olivia's house is my house. I live in a little 1930s house near Golden Gate Park. I walk in the park every day, and it's such a beautiful, magical place. And depending on the season and honestly where the fog is and how it works, it's just so inspirational and so beautiful. And so it wasn't hard to conjure up that canvas. What was sort of tricky was, making a picture for the San Francisco Giants, a vampire. And I think I just went slowly and kind of figured out how much I could do to put all of this in a real life setting, getting on a train, taking the subway to work. So the subway car is outside of my house. And, if you've ever ridden public transportation, you must have had a moment at some point when you saw somebody who seemed a little bit fantastical to you, or you were walking down the street and you saw somebody who was a little bit larger than life. So I do think that, a writer's job is to sort of take all of that and then figure out how to put it into a compelling story. I think the harder part of writing this book or writing a trilogy is figuring out what do you do now and what do you do later.
Yeah. Did you plan the whole thing out once you realized that it was more than just one novel? Did you stop and kind of plan for all of them, or did you just handle the first book and think, the rest will come when I'm ready?
No, I did. I mean, after a while, when it became very apparent that there was going to be, need to be 3 books, I started thinking about how I was going to parse out the story and what was going to happen next. And I intended to finish this much sooner and then got kind of interrupted by 48 states. And so it's too bad because in the 3rd book, Olivia is going to be asked to help elect a woman president. And boy, would I have liked that book to have come out, now instead of later. But nevertheless, I think it'll still be relevant. And it's given me some time to add some elements that might not have been there had I written it sooner. But I definitely started plotting it out. And I have I write everything out by hand and then I type it in. But I also have, as a part of my work, what would I call it? Like an intensity sort of graph. Like I'm constantly looking at how many chapters I go where nothing has happened. And I'm really careful to not allow readers to sort of drift off into boring conversations or mundane things. I like to make sure that the pace of these books and the things that are happening to Olivia and her characters is consistently thrilling so that people frankly don't want to put the book down. And I get a lot of notes from people randomly who say things like, I stayed up all night reading 48 States, and I've gotten some early reviews of the others. People say I couldn't put this book down. Well, good. That's what I wanted for you. I wanted that for people. You've had that feeling. That's how I felt that when I read the very first Harry Potter novel. I was stuck in an airport. I picked it up at a bookstore. I got on the airplane and then I looked up and the plane was landing. Woo, that's great. I hope, that's what you hope you can do for readers when you sit down. At least that's what I want to do. I want people to have a good time and to be lost in a different world.
Yeah. So that constant checks and balances exercise that you go through, where does that come from? Is that just something you stumbled upon as you were writing, or is that say, a skill you learned somewhere else that you apply to your writing?
Oh gosh, I think that is a skill that I learned through, mentoring and, studying to be a writer and being with other writers and reading books and, the feedback I got on early versions of things. I have a really good editor who I work with, who's in the Bay Area with me, who has helped me to be really mindful of these things. So, and I think if you're not reading a lot, it's hard to be a good writer. And I think we all know when we get to a book and we get in a middle place and we're like, it's like being stuck in traffic, like you're just not going anywhere. And, nobody wants that. You want to be engaged. So it's a little bit of me, and I think a little bit of just absorbing good lessons and mentoring and editing along the way.
Do you find when you're writing something like this with paranormal and fantasy elements that your own reading tends to gravitate towards that, or do you consciously read, say, more broadly or outside the genre?
I read outside. I don't want those, characters in my head, and especially really good books. Like I have a number of I know books that are going to be really good by authors that have been released, and I'm sort of waiting until I'm done with my writing assignments because I don't want those characters in my head. So my guilty pleasure, which my husband refers to as Chardonnay, is I like to read historical romances. I generally hew towards ones that have plucky women, characters like the first female doctor or women who secretly write novels in the Victorian era. They have to have strong female protagonists. And I read a lot of nonfiction and, news. I'm a pretty voracious news reader. I probably read, 5 or 6 different, newspapers or magazines on a daily basis, which I don't think is good for your health right now, but I do it anyway.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the trilogy. As we said, The Others is book 1, and it's out now.
Yes.
You have plans for 2 more, and as you mentioned before we started recording, you now have release dates for them. So can you tell us a little bit about your plans for the trilogy?
Well, so there's a lot of the first book ends in a cliffhanger. Spoiler there, but I think it's and you really you don't know what Olivia is up to. And then the second book opens with her dealing with the aftermath of some explosive reveals, and she's in a bad frame of mind and is sort of bent on revenge for some things that are happened, and it takes her to Eastern Europe. So the majority of the second book takes place in Serbia and Slovenia, which is a very mysterious sort of part of the world. And she takes a job as an election monitor, which I'm not sure many people know that those exist, but of course I'm aware of it given my background. So she takes a job as an elections monitor as a ruse to, keep up with one of her enemies, and basically encounters a series of near-death experiences, all the while still training to become a stronger, version of herself. And goes through a series of relationship and emotional sorts of awareness moments and decisions, and comes to the end of book 2 still very much unresolved on certain things and kind of clear on others. And we get rid of one villain and reintroduce another. And then by the third book, Olivia is starting to mature and have a lot more self-awareness about what's going on, and is invited to be a part of running this campaign for president. And this is somebody she'll meet in the second book who has a different job at the moment. And she then becomes the sort of supernatural advance team for a presidential election, which again, I think is not something that's ever been written about. And really the whole idea of doing it thrilled me, right? Because it's like overlaying the complexities of a presidential campaign and then putting in supernatural elements, and how this team is going to deal with it was really fun. And that book is actually finished. I have a somewhat good second draft sitting in my inbox from my editor. And then it allowed me to introduce all of these strange, sorts of things that are going on with women in the far right sphere. So I guess I'll give you one spoiler. Olivia was kidnapped at one moment, and they try to burn her at the stake like a witch. And there's just a lot of commentary on what the discourse is about women. And then by the end of it, I wouldn't, everything gets wrapped up somewhat neatly, but I leave the door open. I'm not going to redo this trilogy, but I am going to probably spin it off into a new detective, a supernatural detective series where some of these characters go after stolen or lost objects that are magic that in the wrong hands could be problematic. So I'm kind of playing around with keeping them alive. I think I like these people so much, I just can't let them go. But we'll see.
Right.
Uh, it's a lot of work. And, I have 3 books coming out in a year. I'm a little bit tired. I'm considering taking like a year off and just studying a foreign language, or doing something totally different with my brain and then coming back to it. But the core group in this trilogy, Olivia, William, Joseph, Elsa, her time walker, Lily, her best friend, and a few others, they stay throughout the trilogy consistently. A few characters here and there, I'm sorry to say, have to go. But overall, that core group, that friendship, that family remains. And I think it becomes a very fun part of staying with the trilogy is the interaction between these folks as they push and pull on each other and kind of knit a tighter relationship together.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then it's nice that you've written characters that you like so much, you want to continue spending time with.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll keep our fingers crossed then for possible spin-off series.
Yeah, I think that, I've been collecting in my library a bunch of different books on cursed objects and symbolism. And so I'm looking forward to eventually, reading up and sort of getting some ideas on what should, disappear first.
Right.
And I went on a vacation not long ago where I went cave scuba diving, and I was like in this very dark cave, and I looked up and there were like thousands of bats. And I thought, okay, this is scary. I'm glad I have a reason to be doing this as a writer. But I was thinking you could hide something in a cave like that. And
Yes. That
it
would
would
be a
be,
huge deterrent against
yeah,
even trying to look for something like that. Wow.
exactly. Right.
Okay.
Who would want to steal something in the middle of a cave with bats? Don't you want to find out? I do. So,
Well, you mentioned earlier that this trilogy was interrupted by your other book, 48 States.
right.
So 48 States, the first book that you released then, not the first book you wrote.
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about 48 States if you don't mind.
Well, 48 States contemplates a time when there's been mass domestic terrorism in the United States, so much so that the US has decided to sort of, by using eminent domain, or in this case, executive order, which is how the US actually created the internment camps for the Japanese. I sort of got obsessed with the idea that with the stroke of a pen, you could do something like that. So I envisioned the United States in the not too distant future where the US takes over various states, that's why there's only 48, and makes them into fracking territories. The notion being that we could avoid conflict with foreign terrorists by basically 100% producing our own oil and gas. Climate change is not a part of this discussion, and the heroine of that book is a truck driver in the territories who's gone there after her husband is killed himself. He's a veteran of one of a number of wars in Syria and other foreign countries, and he's killed himself, and she's gone off to be a fracking driver to support her family. Her father has died. Her mom is a librarian in Haley, Idaho. I have a thing for librarians, which we can talk about if you want. And she meets up with a man in the middle of the road, literally, who is a scientist who's out to prove that these fracking territories are damaging the environment. And the two of them go on an adventure to, basically save the country. And the villain in it is a maniacal CEO who is running these fracking territories and wants to overthrow the government in order to obtain more territory. And he's just a kind of he looks a lot like Donald Trump, but at the time when I started fooling around with this idea, he wasn't really an issue. It just, again, it's a kind of a manifestation of how science fiction can ultimately in a writer's brain show up in a timely way, because we were moving in these kinds of directions, if not here, certainly globally. And so River is another one of these women who, she's been a soldier in the war. She's a mother. Now she's a driver in this fracking territory. And she just doesn't know, who is she supposed to be? Is she supposed to be tender? Is she supposed to be a mercenary? Is she supposed to be able to love somebody? How does she put herself back together? And through this adventure, she finds a way to, certainly she falls in love, but what she really understands and comes to do is to love herself, to be at peace with herself, which I thought was a very poignant and kind of interesting thing to write about.
And once again, strong female characters seem
Yes.
to be dominating your stories. Do they always come first? Do your characters always come first, or is it maybe a plot idea or setting or?
I think that the plot idea came first for 48 States. I had a very clear sense of this dystopian landscape, and the characters came later. And I will tell you, the reason the order of this happened is that a writer friend I knew an agent who was looking for something, and the agent was more interested in 48 States than the other things I was working on. And so I really went to work and tried to finish that novel and put everything else on the back burner. And then once I handed it off, they weren't interested. But then I had this novel. So I was like, well, I'm stubborn. I'm just going to finish it. And because I had been so connected to the characters in this trilogy, at first, it took me a while to really connect with River and Finn and the rest of them. And this is where my editor, Cassandra, came in, because she really helped me to dig in and to make that journey. And ultimately, I self-published that book through my own printing imprint, but it became a starred review on Kirkus, and it won Best Indie Book for the year. And I'm very proud of what a poignant story it is. I think Kirkus said it was the equivalent of like a set of brass knuckles to your skull or something like that. It ended up being a really intense book. But, maybe there are enough strong women characters in the world, but I don't think so. And I think that girls need role models, and they also need a way to internally, I think, work through the struggles that we all feel at various moments about who we are, and how we get to be the people we want to be. And, I don't want to be unfair to men. Men are evolutionary and they go through these things. And for those of us who have great partners and colleagues, we're dealing with people who are going through their own human experiences. So I don't want to be ignorant or kind of disrespectful, but I do think that women in general have some challenges when they try to figure out who they are. If you're a working mom, it's like you're half of the time you're a great mom, and half the time you're a bad one, and half the time you're a great employee, and half the time you're not. I mean, we're always juggling multiple things. And I just think that those journeys can be satisfying, for people to read about and find ways to connect to their own situations.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mentioned you have a thing for librarians, so I think we really do need to discuss what that is.
Well, I've always been a huge supporter of public libraries. I mean, since I was a child, I've enjoyed libraries. And then as a professional running my own public affairs firm, I've done a lot of campaigns to help libraries gain their annual funding or rebuild their branches. And I just have a big belief in libraries in general, because I think that the universal free access to books and material, to information, is such an important part of democracy. And so I just think librarians rock. So the mother in 48 States is a librarian. River is a voracious reader. She has books shipped to her in the territory, and the postal, workers are always making fun of her for having books. And in the Council Trilogy, Olivia's best friend is a San Francisco librarian, and she's a fairy, and her hallmark is public service. And so she makes sure that people can always get the books that they want when they go to the library. So I think librarians are kind of unsung heroes. And again, we're in a moment when it's a very difficult time to be a public librarian and to try to be helping people read things that are important to them. And we've got, a lot of Monday morning quarterbacking going on that. So I'm happy to do something that pays tribute to what I think is a really important hallmark of democracy.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, nicely said. Good. Okay. Well, it sounds like you've got a lot going on. Finishing this trilogy, possibly a new series in the works. If people want to learn more about you, the books, upcoming releases, things you have going on, where can they go to find you and that information?
Well, they can go to my website, which luckily is, evettedavis.com. And then I have a Substack newsletter, which they can subscribe to on my newsletter. And I'm on Instagram and I'm on Facebook, and people occasionally email me and I write back. So I look forward to hearing from people and staying in touch with folks. And I'm glad that my daughter is a junior in college, because I don't think I'd be able to do as much of this if I still had, the day-to-day responsibilities of soccer practice and math tutoring or whatever. So, I'm in a kind of sweet spot as an empty nester where I have the luxury of using all of my free time to do things that are creative and satisfying. And I feel very fortunate to be in that moment right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if people want to purchase a copy of your new release, The Others, or 48 States, where can they go to buy them?
Well, first and foremost, I hope everybody will go to their local bookstore and ask for them. The book officially was released September 17th, and it's in public libraries for those of you who want to use that as a resource. And then, of course, it's on Amazon and Kobo and Barnes and Noble and all those other usual suspects. But I definitely hope people will try their local bookstore first, because I'm a big believer in supporting local bookstores in San Francisco.
Very good. Well, Evette, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast, and I want to wish you luck with The Others and the rest of the Council Trilogy when those come out. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much, Stacey. It was a pleasure to be on your program today. Be well.
Thanks very much. The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.